G'day everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Now, this video was originally posted for only my patrons, but thanks to their generosity and their decision, they decided to let me make this public for you as well. So, this is the how to forge of the long Bowie that I made for my Bowie build-off entry. And we're starting off with a 1860s or 1870s Sheffield double-ended Rasp. I had done some spark testing on it, which is why there was a corner cutoff earlier, and now we're just utilizing that to get our point forged in. And obviously, as with every how to forge, we're trying to make sure that we're getting our preform nice and accurate so that we don't have trouble when we come to the final beveling and final profile of the blade. So I'm going to get down to a nice fine point, and I'm also taking very great care to forge the teeth of the rasp in. There are multiple ways to go about forging from a rasp. You can either grind the teeth off beforehand, which leaves the open pockets, or you can forge the teeth down. You can try and forge weld them in. I don't particularly like that fashion. I find that you can get oil underneath those teeth pretty easily after forging, and if you forge weld them, there's no guarantees. You can also decarburize the steel. So once we've got our point established, we're going to take our 2.5 pound diagonal peen made for me by Bob at B&B Forge, and I'm just going to start getting my distal and my profile tapers set out. Now, I didn't want like a large amount of profile taper in this. I wanted a relatively parallel blade, but I did want some decent distal taper, especially because this rasp is 10 millimeters thick in the center and about 1/4 of an inch thick at either end. It does taper from the center, so I have to spend a little bit of time tapering it out because I decided I was going to use the whole rasp. So with each hammer blow, I'm just overlapping, trying to, again, get a distal taper going, whilst reminding myself that the thinnest part of the rasp at the moment is near me, because it tapers from the center. So focusing most of my hammer work at the center and then working back down towards the tip, and also dressing in the profile taper, because as you dress your distal taper, your work will be expanding in width. And so you need to make sure that you're coming back and dressing your profile taper as well, in order to make sure that you get the desired profile at the end. I'm also pushing that point back a little bit. I didn't want a super long clip point on this, but I did want a fairly well-defined clip point, relatively short for the length of blade. I was going for somewhat of almost a messer kind of look on this, given that it was supposed to be kind of post-apocalyptic, rat rod kind of style, all made out of scrap. So if you haven't seen the build, I will post it very soon. It's already up for my patrons. So again, we're starting to push back towards where the Ricasso and tang will be, making sure that the thickest part will be where the Ricasso is. I am allowing for the fact that as I set down the Ricasso, there will be a slight amount of upsetting, so it will increase the thickness of the Ricasso, but I want that area to already be the thickest point, because that'll make it easier to then get my transition into the blade. I didn't end up with as much distal taper on this as I would usually, because I was trying to be very careful about how thick I forged this, or how thin I forged this. Given that the teeth were quite deep, I didn't want to forge it too thin, as I usually forge very, very close to finish, because there's a good chance that those teeth would then end up on the edge, and that would make it completely useless. So I leave this a lot thicker than I normally would. But now I've got it all established, the taper down towards the tip. I am now working on mashing in the teeth where the tang and the ricasso will be, and then I'm going to set a notch of where I want the blade to start. And then I'll proceed to completely ignore where that notch is, because I decided that I wanted to utilize the entirety of the rasp, and so I pushed it back a little bit, by about 1.5 inches. And now I'm just going to set down, and this is going to be the set down for the ricasso, but I'm going to try and make it parallel all the way across, and that'll make it easier for then when I do my double set down for the tang. I don't want to make a huge set down at this stage, because I always want to be able to come back and refine that, and if you go to your final size before you've finished all of the other processes, you will always end up under dimension, and so always leave a little bit of extra material, and then you can come back to it later and finish it out. So once I had my ricasso established, I'm going to then bring out my guillotine tool, and we're going to set that tang in. It's very important to note at this point that most people make the mistake of making their tang shoulders way too deep. You really don't need more than about 1/8 of an inch of tang set down at your shoulders. If you're setting down any more than that, it's either because you have too little material to draw out your tang, or you're trying to overestimate how much you're going to need of shoulder for your guard. The reality is you do not need a very wide shoulder at the tang base. You actually want as minimal as you can, because that's going to be the area that's going to undergo the most strain. Now obviously here I'm using Preston to draw it out. I could have drawn this out by hand, but obviously it's a lot easier with the press. It only took me 2 goes with the press to get this done, whether it would have taken me 4 or 5 heats to do it by hand. Either way, I'm just working a distal and profile taper on the tang to try and make the thickest point be where the shoulder is to the ricasso. Keeping that ricasso off of the anvil is the most important part. A lot of people, when forging Bowie knives and stuff with set down ricassos, will make the mistake of trying to offset their tang to the spine as well as the ricasso, so that this tang will be in line with the spine at the top and then be set up from the ricasso. You want your tang to be central to the ricasso, and you want your ricasso to be offset to the blade. So make sure that you're getting a nice centralized tang on your ricassos, because otherwise you'll end up with a handle that actually sits above the blade, and that never looks good, and it actually doesn't feel very good in the hand, because the blade is in front of the handle. So again, we're just refining tapers. I was trying to forge this as close to finish as I could, whilst also maintaining thickness, given the fact that I didn't actually know what this material was. I estimate it to be around 1055 or thereabouts, mainly because medium speed quench oil didn't actually harden this. I ended up having to quench it in water, which did harden it quite well. But again, it was very soft under the hammer. It moved like mild steel half the time, so I had to be very careful in my forging. If I hit it too hard, I was going to overdo it, and I was going to end up with a smushed potato instead of a knife. And here we have my new favourite hammer, which was actually donated to me by a friend of mine at the Blacksmiths Association of Western Australia. And it's actually a dog-haired cutlass hammer that was forged in Philadelphia. It's a beautiful piece. It's about 3 pounds, and I've used it religiously since I got it at the Royal Show, and I love it. I put a bit of a different handle on it than what was given to me, but it works absolutely amazing. And as usual, we're just drawing down the bevel at the heel, at the plunge cut, and we're keeping our plunge cut off the anvil, utilizing the edge of the hammer and the edge of the anvil to create that double set down for the plunge cut. There are many ways you can do plunge cuts. I may do a video on doing offset plunge cuts and then recentering, but for now this is my favored method. And again, I'm leaving everything really thick. The edge, I think, after this pass, was about 1/8 of an inch, so 3.2 millimeters thick at the edge, which is insanely thick for what I normally forge. I normally forge down to about 1 millimeter, or about 44 thousandths of an inch. So obviously as we forge, the spine is going to curve upwards. I don't really like to do pre-curve, and especially in this case where the teeth are so deep in the material, you can see the depth of them in some of the shots. Keeping things thick meant that it didn't curve as much as it may have otherwise. It also didn't expand sideways as much as it normally would. There are many material displacement rules for forging, and the general rule is that you will gain your thickness in width when you forge a bevel. In my case here, I think I'm gaining about 3/4 of thickness because I'm not forging a full bevel. I'm keeping it relatively narrow. But even so, it did bend, and when I got to the halfway point here, I ended up deciding to straighten it with a wooden mallet, which I don't think I caught on film for some reason. I think I forgot to hit the start button, but you'll see it straighten out just kind of in this next shot or two, and that was just to make it easier to then forge the rest of the bevels, and then there'll be another straightening process at the end. Given that I left the edge so thick, you will actually see me forge on the edge quite a bit, and that's purely because there is little risk of it folding over or crumpling, given that there's so much mass behind that edge, and that actually made it a lot easier for straightening and to true up my profile. I'm also very aware that as I'm forging, there are those serrated teeth at the edge of the knife that are coming from the edge of the file, and I'm going to have to grind those out. So whatever width I end up with, I'm going to lose 1 millimeter, maybe 1.5 millimeters to those teeth. So again, I'm forging thick and grinding thin in this instance. Now some may want to leave this tip as a swept tip clip point. I've done a video on making a trailing point Bowie previously, which I will link in the cards. But in this instance I wanted a slightly dropped point for a more central pointed Bowie for a more multi-purpose slashing and stabbing, if you like, rather than being a more slashy type. I have a video again on knife design, specifically Bowie design for tip geometries that I'll also link in the cards if I remember. But as I go, I'm going to be straightening. It's just going to make things easier. Keeping everything straight means that I don't have to worry about everything getting bent out of shape and me forging in the wrong position. When you come to forging the tip, you're always going to want to increase your bevel angle just a little bit. You don't want to continue the same bevel angle that you were using with the wider belly portion, purely because if you do so, you'll be thinning the tip substantially in a way that you may not be able to control, and it may end up that the hammer falls flat rather than beveled, and you'll end up with a flat tip, which never looks good. So instead, you want to slightly increase your bevel angle. The way I do that is by slightly lifting and turning my hand so that the bevel follows the anvil a little bit more. So that basically the hammer is coming to the edge square. Much like when you use a grinder, you want to keep the edge square to the grinder platen. I want to keep the hammer square to the blade, rather than coming at it from the side, if you like, or along the length of the blade. Now I'm straightening here, but this is in preemption for Kitai, which is wet forging. I wanted to forge this as clean and as close as I could, and one of the best ways to do that is by using Kitai, which is a wet forging process, Japanese process. And so I was making sure to keep the hammer and the anvil nice and wet, and making sure to move the blade over the water, because the moment you hit the blade on top of the water, that water's gone. So if you're going to use Kitai, you need to make sure that you continue to keep moving the blade. Here I'm actually using a wooden mallet to straighten out that area above the Ricasso, because I found that the Ricasso was slightly offset, and that happens a lot when you're drawing out the bevels near the heel. You get some quite satisfying pops from the from Kitai when you do it properly, and I always like to like those. Although sometimes they can be a little bit more explosive than you intend them to and come off like a gunshot. So just be very careful and warn anyone if they're about that you are doing wet forging, because it can be quite surprising when suddenly there's a loud bang when they weren't expecting it. That steam explosion is, however, very necessary to the process of Kitai, which is to blow off the scale. It actually cools the scale on the surface of the steel, and then that steam expansion then blows away those scale fragments. It's the cooling that actually removes the scale. The steam explosion is there purely to get rid of them from under the blade. If you were to basically scrub that scale away instead, it would have the same process, but it would have the same end result, but the same thing cannot be said of that, because once you take the blade away from the anvil, while it's in the air, it is continuing to oxidize, and so it would build up more scale while you're forging anyway. So so here I'm actually recentering the edge by putting the plunge cut on the anvil and striking the Ricasso. I ended up overdoing this a little bit and had to fix it in grinding, and this is something that happens when when the blade has the heat waves coming off it. It can make it look a little bit different to what is actually really happening. And if I had seen it before I did my preheat treat grinding, I probably would have gone back to the forge and recentered it by forging. But I had done my preheat treat grinding at that point, so I decided to just grind to center. Luckily, leaving it so thick meant that I had the opportunity to do so. If you're forging closer to finish, you wouldn't have that option. And of course, straightening can be done at a much lower temperature, especially with this material, which is so soft. Again, this video is coming to you thanks to my patrons, so a massive thank you to them. If you want to join the Patreon crew, the link will be in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Be safe. Bye-bye.